strike on Ukraine using a newly developed hypersonic ballistic missile was designed to warn the West that Moscow will respond to moves by the US and the UK to let Kyiv strike Russia with their missiles, the Kremlin has said Friday. Dasha Chernishova brings the latest from Moscow.
In a national television address, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Moscow was conducting, quote, combat tests of the new missile system in response to what he called NATO aggressive actions. The Kremlin said it was in no doubt that Washington had understood the warning. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov on Friday reiterated that the launch of Russia's hypersonic Oreshnik missile was to make it clear to the West that its actions will not be left without a reaction from the Russian side. Moscow says the Western countries' permission for Ukraine to hit Russia with long-range missiles is reckless and accuses the West of stoking a major escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. Peskov said that the Russian side had clearly demonstrated the capabilities and outlined the contours of further response actions in case Russian concerns are not taken into account. He noted that after Putin's address on Thursday, there were no contacts on the Russian side with the administration of Joe Biden. Peskov said also that Moscow would have preferred that Washington had listened to Putin's earlier statements, in which he outlined in detail Russian position on permission to use foreign missile equipment for strikes deep into the Russian territory. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called the Biden administration's actions on Ukraine an attempt to, quote, mess up the work of the future Trump administration. Early in the week, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the outgoing administration is deliberately provoking an escalation with Russia in the weeks it has left. Russian Defense Ministry said on Friday that 5 US-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles and 2 UK-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles were shot down in a week. The permission for Ukraine has been called by several Russian lawmakers as an escalation that could lead to World War III and the end of the Ukrainian statehood. Putin also warned that Russia, quote, had the right to strike Western countries that provided Kyiv with weapons used against Russian targets. He also said Moscow would warn the civilian population in Ukraine should there be another launch of this experimental weapon. The Russian president said that Oreshnik cannot be intercepted by the existing air defense systems. Russian Defense Ministry said on Friday that over the course of the past week, the Russian armed forces carried out 30 group strikes, including with the hypersonic air ballistic missile Kinzhal against Ukrainian military-industrial complex targets. Earlier in the week, Russian president changed the country's nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. A new framework would mean an attack against Russia by a non-nuclear country supported by a nuclear one would be regarded as a joint attack. Meanwhile, the Kremlin insists it is placing maximum effort to avoid nuclear conflict and that it hopes that Western countries would do the same. Russia also accelerated its military output and increased its defense spending, with the new draft budget expected to raise it by another 25% in next year, exceeding 6% of the country's GDP. Russian state television widely reported the use of Oreshnik as a way to prevent any further escalation, and Putin's approval ratings remain over 75%. Dasha Chernishova in Moscow for AnewZ.
Meanwhile, NATO says Russia's use of an experimental intermediate-range ballistic missile against Ukraine will not change the course of the conflict. The North Atlantic Alliance will hold talks with Ukrainian officials in Brussels next week following the latest developments. Megumi Lim is covering the story from Kyiv.
Tensions between Ukraine and Russia has significantly risen this week, with missile attacks intensifying on both sides. The U.S. lifting restrictions on Ukraine's use of American-supplied ATACMS missiles on Sunday, which Washington said was done in response to North Korean troops joining the fight alongside Russian forces, and Ukraine wasting no time in launching them a few days later, followed by the use of the British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles against Russia's Kursk region, reportedly hitting a command center for Russian and North Korean troops. And on Thursday, Russian President Vladimir Putin saying that for the first time, Moscow had launched a new experimental missile called the Oreshnik an intermediate-range ballistic missile to strike Ukraine's eastern city of Dnipro. The attack against Dnipro damaged an industrial enterprise and set off fires in the city. 2 people were hurt, according to the regional governor. Authorities also said a rehabilitation center for people with disabilities was damaged during the strike. At the time of the attack, there were reportedly 7 people, including a child, inside the center. All of them survived. Ukraine initially identified the missile used by Russia as an intercontinental ballistic missile. But in the first public assessment of the weapon, which was released by Ukraine's military intelligence on Friday, the missile reached a top speed of more than 13,000 kilometers per hour and took about 15 minutes to reach its target from its launch site. The missile was equipped with 6 warheads, which were each equipped with 6 submunitions. This new Russian missile is capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, but Russian President Vladimir Putin said it was not nuclear armed in this instance. The Pentagon deputy spokesperson Sabrina Singh said Russia, through nuclear risk reduction channels, did give the U.S. a brief advance warning about the use of this missile just before the strike. The Pentagon also said that it hasn't seen no indication that Russia was preparing to use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine. President Zelensky has called for strong worldwide condemnation against Russia's use of this new missile. He said, quote, "This is a clear and a severe escalation in the scale and brutality of this war," and added that it was, quote, "more proof that Russia has no interest in peace." German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also responded on Friday, saying the deployment of the new weapons showed, quote, "how dangerous this war is," and called it a terrible escalation. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said there was a real risk of a global conflict breaking out. He said, quote, "the conflict is taking on dramatic proportions. The last few dozen hours have shown that the threat is serious and real, and that, quote, we feel that the unknown is approaching." To protect the skies over Ukraine, Kyiv has repeatedly urged its Western partners to provide more air defense systems. NATO and Ukraine have said they will hold talks next week in Brussels to discuss Russia's firing of this experimental hypersonic intermediate-range missile. The meeting was called by Kyiv and will be held at an ambassadorial level. With the arrival of winter, officials here are expecting more strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Already, Russia's Sunday air attack against Ukraine, which was one of the biggest of the war, reportedly hit 3 of the 5 working thermal plants owned by Ukrainian power giant DTEK, according to a Reuters report. 200 missiles and drones were launched by Russia that day. Energy officials have warned that Ukraine may face up to 20 hours of power cuts per day if attacks like these continued. With the war escalating, tensions have been running high on the ground here in Kyiv as well. On Friday, the Ukrainian parliament cancelled its session due to potential security threats. This comes after the U.S. and other embassies closed for the day on Wednesday after warnings of a potential large-scale missile attack. Megumi Lim for AnewZ in Kyiv.